The Battle of Fromelles, fought on 19 to 20 July 1916, was the Australian Imperial Forces (AIF) first major engagement on the Western Front during World War I. Conceived as a diversion to prevent German reinforcements from moving to the Somme, the attack resulted in a catastrophic loss for the Allied forces, particularly the Australians. Hi there, I'm Kyle, the host of History of Human Evolution. With a PhD in history and a love for storytelling, I'm here to guide you through the fascinating journey of our species. If you like to explore the past, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts below. In July 1916, the Western Front stretched in an unbroken line of mud, trenches, and barbed wire from the North Sea to the Swiss border. After 2 years of stalemate and attrition, the Allies launched a massive offensive along the Somme River to break the deadlock. The British command, under General Sir Douglas Haig, planned supporting operations to draw German reserves away from the main effort. One such operation was devised near the village of Fromelles, a quiet sector in northern France held by experienced German troops behind well-prepared defenses. This sector had seen little change since 1915, but its geographic position made it suitable for a feint. The idea was to stage an assault that would appear to the Germans as the beginning of a major push, forcing them to commit reinforcements away from the actual front further south. The task of executing this operation fell to 2 divisions: the 61st, 2nd South Midland Division of the British Army and the recently arrived 5th Australian Division, fresh to the Western Front, untested in its terrain, and unfamiliar with the scale of industrial warfare that defined this theater. The Australian Imperial Force had earned a formidable reputation during the Gallipoli campaign, but the conditions of trench warfare in France were unlike anything they had faced before. At Fromelles, they confronted a formidable German line with commanding fields of fire, reinforced bunkers, deep dugouts, and a lethal network of machine guns and artillery. Intelligence on the enemy's strength and defensive depth was incomplete, yet the attack was pressed forward with urgency, driven by the broader strategy unfolding on the Somme. Preparations were rushed. The planning lacked the precision that would later become standard on the Western Front. Communication trenches were inadequate, artillery support was insufficiently targeted, and coordination between the British and Australian forces was minimal. Nevertheless, the decision stood. The assault was scheduled for July 19, 1916, intended to commence in the evening, giving the illusion of a renewed full-scale offensive. For the men of the 5th Australian Division, it would mark their brutal introduction to the realities of the Western Front. At precisely 6 p.m. on July 19, 1916, the attack began. Allied artillery had pounded the German positions for several days, but the bombardment had done little to destroy the concrete blockhouses or the deep dugouts of the German 6th Army. As the men of the 5th Australian Division and the 61st British Division climbed out of their trenches and moved into no man's land, they were met almost immediately with a storm of machine gun and rifle fire. The battlefield at Fromelles was flat and exposed, a terrain that offered little natural cover. The advance had to cross more than 400 meters of open ground, much of it waterlogged and littered with barbed wire. German machine gun posts had been largely untouched by the preliminary shelling, and they opened fire with lethal precision. Within minutes, entire waves of attacking troops were cut down before reaching the German front line. Despite the devastation, some elements of the 14th and 15th Australian Brigades breached the German trenches. They entered the front line in brutal hand-to-hand combat, overrunning parts of the enemy's positions. However, these limited gains quickly became untenable. Communication with the rear was nearly impossible, and flanking support had failed to materialize. The captured trenches were heavily shelled by German artillery, and repeated counterattacks made holding ground virtually impossible. On the British flank, the 61st Division was also struggling. Coordination between the two forces had broken down early in the assault, and without synchronized advances, the exposed flanks of the Australian units were vulnerable. Attempts to send reinforcements into the German lines proved futile, as narrow communication trenches became death traps under sustained artillery fire. Ammunition ran low, and wounded men lay stranded in no man's land, calling out through the night. By the early hours of July 20th, it was clear that the operation had failed. Units that had advanced into the German lines were either destroyed, captured, or forced to retreat. Some men were trapped behind enemy lines, cut off from their units with no means of withdrawal. As daylight returned, the battlefield was littered with bodies. Wounded soldiers who tried to crawl back across no man's land were targeted by snipers. Others remained motionless for hours to avoid drawing fire. The attack was officially called off by 8 a.m., less than 14 hours after it began. Survivors limped or were carried back to their trenches, stunned by the scale of the loss. Of the more than 7,000 casualties, the Australians alone had suffered 5,500, including nearly 2,000 killed. It was the worst 24-hour period in Australian military history. The objective had not been achieved. The German lines remained intact. The sacrifice had brought no strategic gain. When the attack was finally halted on the morning of July 20th, 1916, the full extent of the disaster began to emerge. The 5th Australian Division had suffered 5,533 casualties, including over 1,900 killed, over 3,000 wounded, and hundreds taken prisoner. In less than 24 hours, the division had been gutted. The 61st British Division, which had attacked alongside them, reported approximately 1,547 casualties, many sustained in the early stages of the assault. German losses, by comparison, were significantly lighter, estimated at fewer than 2,000. The battlefield, a flat expanse near Fromelles, was left strewn with the bodies of fallen Australians. Many of the wounded had crawled into craters and shell holes, only to die there slowly through the night. Those still alive at dawn were often shot by German snipers as they attempted to withdraw. The cries of the wounded carried across no man's land for hours, but few could be rescued. Several stretcher-bearers were killed trying to reach them. The official reports from the British High Command described the battle as a diversionary success, but the reality on the ground told a different story. The attack had failed to draw German reinforcements away from the Somme. It had not broken enemy lines or achieved any tactical advantage. Instead, it had introduced Australian troops to the Western Front with a catastrophic loss of life, leaving entire units decimated. The 5th Division was rendered combat ineffective and required months to rebuild before it could take part in further operations. In Australia, the news was slow to arrive but devastating in impact. Families across the country received telegrams in waves, many within days of each other, informing them that sons, brothers, or fathers were missing, wounded, or killed. For many towns and rural communities, the Battle of Fromelles became a national trauma, its losses more severe than those sustained on any single day during the entire Gallipoli campaign. After the battle, German troops buried many of the Australian and British dead behind their lines. These burials went unrecorded for decades. It wasn't until the early 21st century that mass graves were discovered at Pheasant Wood, near Fromelles. In 2009, the remains of 250 soldiers, mostly Australians, were recovered and reinterred at a newly established Fromelles, Pheasant Wood, military cemetery, each given a marked grave and, where possible, a name. The aftermath of Fromelles left a lasting mark on the collective memory of the Australian Imperial Force. It was not simply a battlefield defeat. It was a moment of immense human cost that challenged the optimism with which many Australians had viewed their entry into the European war. The tragedy of Fromelles would haunt the AIF throughout the rest of the Western Front campaign. For decades, the Battle of Fromelles was overshadowed in Australian historical memory by the more prominent narratives of Gallipoli and later Western Front engagements, such as Pozieres and Passchendaele. Yet for the men of the 5th Australian Division, Fromelles represented a defining moment, an initiation into the brutal logic of industrial warfare on the Western Front. It was the first major action for Australians in France, and it ended in one of the worst disasters in the nation's military history. Within the military, Fromelles became a reference point for tactical failure, an operation marked by inadequate reconnaissance, poor coordination, and flawed planning at higher command levels. Lessons drawn from its failure would influence Australian approaches to combined arms warfare and divisional coordination in future operations. The AIF adapted, hardened by the shock of Fromelles, and emerged as one of the most respected fighting forces on the Western Front by 1917. The legacy of the battle also endured through absence. Thousands of families never received the remains of their loved ones. Many soldiers killed at Fromelles were hastily buried by German forces, their graves unmarked or recorded only in fragmented reports. For much of the 20th century, they were listed simply as missing. The absence of closure left a silent void in countless Australian households, one that persisted through generations. This began to change in the early 2000s, when amateur historians and researchers uncovered evidence of mass graves at Pheasant Wood, near Fromelles. In 2009, the remains of 250 soldiers were exhumed and reburied in a purpose-built Commonwealth cemetery, many identified by name through DNA analysis. The reinterment marked one of the largest and most significant recoveries of World War I remains in modern history. Commemorations now take place annually at the Fromelles, Pheasant Wood Military Cemetery, the VC Corner Cemetery, and the Australian Memorial Park, all located near the battlefield. These memorials have transformed Fromelles from a forgotten episode into a solemn site of national remembrance. The battle, once hidden in the footnotes of official war histories, now occupies a central place in Australia's understanding of its military past. For the Australian War Memorial, schools, and veterans groups, Fromelles has come to symbolize not only the tragedy of war, but also the enduring commitment to honor those who were lost. It is remembered not for glory or victory, but for the weight of sacrifice borne by ordinary men, many of them barely out of their youth, who were sent into an impossible battle on foreign soil. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.